In the shadowed margins of ancient scripture, there exists a name that was meant to be forgotten. A king so monstrous, so impossibly vast, that scribes trembled when recording his existence, and later generations would systematically erase his story from the sacred texts. His name was Og, and he was the last of the Rephaim, the giant kings who ruled the earth before the floodwaters came to cleanse it. But Og did not die with his brothers. Somehow, impossibly, he survived. The answer touches the very foundations of biblical history and challenges everything we think we know about the world before Moses, before Abraham, before the covenant that would define Western civilization. Og represents a doorway into a stranger, darker past, when giants walked among men and the line between the human and the monstrous was written in blood. Chapter 1. The giant who walked before the flood. Before Abraham was born, before the Tower of Babel reached toward heaven, before even Noah built his ark, the world belonged to the Nephilim. The book of Genesis speaks of them in veiled language. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. The Nephilim were born of a forbidden union, a violation of the boundary between heaven and earth. Were the sons of God fallen angels who lusted after human women? Were they the righteous line of Seth, corrupted by the daughters of Cain? The ancient texts offer no clarity, only the terrible fact. Something unholy had occurred, and the result was a race of giants who filled the earth with violence. These were not merely tall men. The rabbinic writings describe beings of monstrous proportion and appetites to match. They consumed everything in their path, devouring the crops of men, then the men themselves, then turning upon each other in an orgy of destruction that made the earth cry out for deliverance. God looked upon his creation and saw that the wickedness of man was great, and that every imagination of his heart was only evil continually. The solution was total annihilation. The flood would come, covering even the highest mountains, drowning every living thing that breathed air. But there was Og. The Midrash preserves his origin story in terms both fascinating and horrible. Og was said to be the son of Ahijah, who was herself the daughter of the fallen angel Shemhazai. Some texts identify him as one of the Rephaim, the giant clan that would later inhabit Canaan. His name, Og, may derive from the Hebrew word for cake, or round bread, a mocking reference to his survival of the flood by riding atop the ark. The image is striking and deeply unsettling. While humanity huddled inside the ark as the world died around them, this giant creature, this remnant of the condemned race, clung to the roof. The rabbis say he made an oath to Noah and his descendants, swearing eternal servitude in exchange for his preservation. Noah, whether from compassion or fear, agreed. Every day, food was passed through the hole to feed the giant above, even as the waters rose higher and higher, even as every other living thing perished. But why did God permit this? If the flood's purpose was to cleanse the earth of the Nephilim and their violence, why allow even one to survive? The texts offer no answer, leaving us with a theological nightmare. Perhaps Og's survival was not part of the divine plan at all. Perhaps he represented a test for future generations, a remnant of evil left deliberately in the world so that humanity would have to choose between righteousness and corruption. When the waters receded and Noah's family emerged to repopulate the earth, Og was still there, waiting, watching, an immortal witness to the old world, carrying with him the knowledge and the violence of the age before the flood. He did not integrate into the new humanity. Instead, he went north and east to the land that would become known as Bashan, and there he established his kingdom. Og's longevity became the stuff of legend. By the time Moses encountered him, the giant had lived for centuries, possibly millennia. He had seen the entire arc of post-flood history unfold. He had watched as Noah's descendants spread across the earth and divided into nations. He had witnessed the construction and destruction of the Tower of Babel. He had seen Abraham migrate from Ur to Canaan. This impossible span of years had given Og something beyond mere physical power. He had accumulated forbidden knowledge, the kind of wisdom that belonged to the world before the flood. He knew where the old places of power were buried. He knew the names that should not be spoken, the rituals that God had tried to drown. And in Bashan, he used that knowledge to build something terrible. Chapter 2. The Kingdom of Darkness in Bashan. Og's kingdom was built on principles that predated the covenant, that reached back to the violent world before the flood. The book of Deuteronomy records that he ruled 60 fortified cities, all belonging to the region of Argob in Bashan. These were not ordinary settlements. The text specifies that they were cities with high walls, gates, and bronze bars, besides a great many unwalled villages. But what were these cities defending? The answer lies in the nature of Bashan itself. This was the heartland of the Rephaim, and Og had transformed it into a sanctuary for practices that the God of Israel had explicitly forbidden. The land became synonymous with the old ways, the pre-flood corruption that had necessitated the deluge in the first place. The rabbis spoke of Og's cities with a mixture of awe and horror. They described walls built by giants, for giants, with stones so massive that ordinary men could not have moved them. Archaeological remains from the region do reveal megalithic structures, stone circles, and dolmens that suggest a culture with either advanced engineering capabilities or access to labor on an inhuman scale. Og's personal dwelling was the stuff of nightmare. The book of Deuteronomy preserves a curious detail. For only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of giants. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. Is it not in Rabbath of the children of Ammon? 9 cubits was the length thereof, and 4 cubits the breadth of it, after the cubit of a man. 9 cubits by 4 cubits. In modern measurements, approximately 13.5 feet long by 6 feet wide. This was not a bed, but a monument, a statement of power and otherness. The fact that it was made of iron is significant. In the Bronze Age, iron was rare and difficult to work, associated with meteoric metal and divine craftsmanship. An iron bed of this size would have required immense resources and skill to construct. But why preserve it? Why was Og's bed displayed in Rabbath of the Ammonites like a trophy or a warning? The text does not say, but the implication is clear. This was proof. Proof that Og had existed, proof that giants had walked the earth, proof that the stories were not mere legend. The rabbinic texts expand on the nature of Og's rule with details that never made it into the biblical canon. They speak of sacrifices that would make the offerings to Molech seem tame by comparison. They describe rituals conducted at the high places, the altars on mountaintops where the old gods were worshipped with blood and fire. In Og's kingdom, the prohibitions that would later define Israelite religion did not exist. Og himself was described as a being of impossible vitality. The measurements given for his bed suggest he stood somewhere between 12 and 15 feet tall, though some rabbinic traditions claim he was much larger. One midrash states that Moses himself was 10 cubits tall and had to leap 10 cubits into the air and strike Og in the ankle with a weapon 10 cubits long to reach any vulnerable spot. But his size was not his greatest weapon. That distinction belonged to his knowledge. Og had lived through the entire history of humanity. He had seen empires rise and fall. He had learned from the sons of God themselves, inheriting their forbidden wisdom. When other kings relied on military might, Og could draw upon centuries of accumulated understanding. This is why Moses feared him, not because of the giant's physical strength, though that was formidable. Moses feared Og because the giant represented something that should not exist, a walking violation of divine judgment. A creature who had already survived one apocalypse and might survive another. The kingdom Og had built in Bashan was not just a political entity. It was a statement, a defiance hurled in the face of heaven. It said that the old world could not be erased, that the flood had failed, that the giants would endure no matter what God decreed. For centuries, that statement stood unchallenged. When the Israelites finally arrived at his borders, Og would teach them what terror truly meant. Chapter 3. The battle that shook the heavens. The confrontation came at Edrei, one of Og's royal cities. The book of Numbers records it with stark simplicity. And they turned and went up by the way of Bashan. And Og, the king of Bashan, went out against them, he and all his people, to the battle at Edrei. But the rabbinic texts reveal a battle far stranger and more terrible than the biblical account suggests. This was not merely a clash of armies. It was a confrontation between the post-flood world order and the last remnant of what came before. When Og learned that the Israelites were approaching Bashan, he could have retreated. But Og did not survive the flood by being a coward. He had waited centuries for this moment, and he intended to end the Israelite threat with a single, devastating blow. The Midrash describes how Og surveyed the Israelite camp and calculated its dimensions. The camp stretched for 3 parasangs, roughly 9 miles. Og's plan was brilliantly simple and utterly insane. He would tear a mountain from the earth, carry it above his head, and drop it upon the Israelite camp, crushing the entire nation in one catastrophic moment. So the giant went to a mountain, and he uprooted it like a man might pull a weed. The mountain came free from the earth with a sound like the breaking of creation itself. Og lifted it above his head and began to walk toward the Israelite camp, intending to bury them beneath stone. But God had not preserved Israel through the plagues of Egypt and the crossing of the Red Sea, only to see them annihilated by a giant's trick. As Og walked with a mountain above his head, God sent worms, boring insects that ate through the stone in seconds. The mountain became riddled with holes, weakened and crumbling, until it collapsed down around Og's head and shoulders, trapping him. The giant's teeth grew out in his desperation to free himself, elongating until they pierced through the stone itself. He was trapped, helpless, the very weapon he had intended to use against Israel now imprisoning him. And in that moment, Moses approached. Moses was 80 years old, an elderly man by any standard. Before him stood a giant who had walked the earth since before the flood, a creature strong enough to uproot mountains. The staff Moses carried was inscribed with the ineffable name of God, and still his hand must have trembled. The texts say that Moses leaped 10 cubits into the air, impossibly high, and struck Og's ankle with a staff that was itself 10 cubits long. Only thus could he reach a vulnerable spot on the giant's body. The blow should not have been fatal. But this was no ordinary weapon, and Moses was no ordinary man. The staff bore the name that had brought plagues upon Egypt. When it struck Og's flesh, it carried with it the full weight of divine judgment, the decree that should have been executed centuries ago when the flood waters rose. Og the Rephaim fell. The last king of the giants crashed to the earth with a sound that echoed across Bashan and Canaan. The ground shook with his impact. And then, impossibly, finally, Og was still. The book of Deuteronomy records what happened next. So the Lord our God delivered into our hands Og also, the king of Bashan, and all his people. And we smote him until none was left to him remaining. And we took all his cities at that time. There was not a city which we took not from them, 80 cities, all the region of Argob, the kingdom of Og in Bashan. 60 cities fell in the aftermath of Og's death. The armies of Israel swept through Bashan like a cleansing fire, tearing down the high places, shattering the altars, destroying every remnant of the giant's rule. The people of these cities were put to the sword according to the harem, the ban of total destruction that God had commanded. The land of Bashan was given to the half-tribe of Manasseh as their inheritance. The cities were rebuilt, repopulated with Israelites. The high places were torn down, but the stones remained. And in Rabbath of the Ammonites, the iron bed was preserved, that future generations might look upon it and remember. With Og's fall, something ended. The last direct link to the pre-flood world was severed. The final king of the giants had been toppled. Yet even in death, Og would not be forgotten. His story would haunt the pages of Scripture, and in time, it would be systematically erased. Chapter 4, the erasure and what remains. The biblical account of Og is remarkable not for what it includes, but for what it omits. In Deuteronomy and Numbers, we get bare facts. Og was king of Bashan, he was defeated at Edrei, his bed was enormous and made of iron. These are the bones of a story with most of the flesh stripped away. Why? To understand the erasure of Og, we must understand the project of biblical redaction, the process by which the various texts and traditions of ancient Israel were compiled, edited, and canonized into scripture. This process took place over centuries, guided by priests and scribes who had very specific theological goals. They wanted to present a coherent narrative of God's relationship with Israel, to establish clear moral boundaries, and to eliminate anything that might lead the people astray. Og represented a problem for this project. His story contained elements that were difficult to reconcile with emerging Orthodox theology. If giants had existed and one had survived the flood, what did that say about the completeness of God's judgment? If Og had lived for centuries, possessing knowledge from before the deluge, did that not suggest sources of power and wisdom outside the covenant relationship? These questions were dangerous. They opened doors to speculation about the nature of evil, the limits of divine power, and the possibility of beings that existed in a gray zone between human and demonic. The scribes made a choice: preserve the essential facts for historical record, but strip away the mythological elaboration. But oral tradition is harder to suppress than written text. The rabbis who studied scripture noticed the gaps and inconsistencies. They asked questions. Why was Og's bed preserved? Why does the text specify that he was the last of the Rephaim? And in asking these questions, they opened the door for the fuller story to survive in the Midrash and Talmud. These rabbinic texts preserve details that are absent from the Bible itself. They tell us that Og rode on Noah's ark, that he uprooted a mountain to throw at Israel, that Moses had to leap impossibly high to strike his ankle. The rabbis themselves would have rejected the question of whether these were literal facts or legends. For them, these stories contained truth, even if they were not literally true. The Midrash Tanshuma, compiled in the 9th century but containing material much older, includes extensive discussions of Og. The Babylonian Talmud, redacted in the 6th century, preserves multiple traditions about the giant king. These texts were not hidden or suppressed. They were studied openly in Jewish communities for centuries. Yet they remained unknown to most of the Christian world until modern times. Christian interpreters, working primarily from the Hebrew Bible and its Greek translation, had access only to the minimal account in Deuteronomy and Numbers. They knew Og as a footnote, a minor enemy defeated during the conquest of Canaan. The elaborate mythology preserved in Jewish tradition was invisible to them. Yet archaeological remains suggest that the kernel of truth in the Og tradition may be larger than skeptics assumed. The region of Bashan does contain megalithic structures that speak to an unusual culture. The biblical text itself acknowledges that something about Og was extraordinary enough to warrant preserving his bed as a memorial. And the pattern of giant clans in Canaan appears repeatedly in Scripture. What we can say with certainty is that Og's story, whether historical, legendary, or some combination of both, served important functions in ancient Israelite culture. It marked the end of an era, the final defeat of the pre-flood world. It demonstrated the power of God to deliver Israel against impossible odds. It served as a warning about the dangers of the old ways and the old gods. What remains beyond doubt is that Og represents a permanent fixture in the biblical imagination. His iron bed sits in Rabbath as a testimony. His 60 cities mark the landscape of Bashan. His name appears in the litany of defeated enemies, a giant brought low by the God of Israel. And his story, partially erased but never fully forgotten, continues to whisper to us across the millennia. The last of the Rephaim has fallen, but his shadow stretches long across the pages of history, and in that shadow, we catch glimpses of a stranger, darker past than the sanitized versions would have us believe. The erasure was incomplete. The memory survives, and Og impossibly endures.